Homestuck may just be one of the biggest failed indie pilots of the post-Has-Been Hotel era. It's confusing, unfunny, lacks direction, and is completely lacking in a foundational premise to build a story on. Yet ironically enough, all these flaws come together to create the most interesting and my favorite animated series pilot of 2025. Do keep in mind that this review is based purely off my impressions of the animated pilot, as I know absolutely nothing about the Homestuck webcomic this is adapted from, as I believe that if you have to read outside material to better appreciate an adaptation, then that adaptation doesn't do a competent job at adapting its source material, which this pilot doesn't seem to do, but we will get there. I'm going to go over a brief summary of what happens in this pilot, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode begins in a desert, showcasing an underground bunker with a masked man operating a computer with 4 monitors. One of the monitors turns on, showing the morning routine of a teenage boy named John Egbert on his birthday. As John cleans up his room, he gets a call from his friend Dave, wishing him happy birthday and asking what he got for a present from his dad. John excitedly reveals that he got a poster and goes to look for a hammer to hang it up with, and the narrator explains the concept of a stack modus, which is an inventory system that all the characters have, which can hold multiple items at a time, but once all the inventory slots are filled, the oldest item acquired will be pushed out of the inventory to make room for new items. Afterwards, Dave asks if the game beta that John ordered had arrived yet, and as John is about to go outside to check the mailbox for the beta, his dad comes home, warranting John to have to sneak to the mailbox to avoid his dad, and hangs up on Dave. On his way down, John gets another call from a friend named Rose asking him if he's got the beta yet. The two banter with each other about Dave, with Rose explaining her attraction towards him and why John is so persistent in avoiding his father, to which John replies it's for the same reason Rose avoids her mother. The two end their conversation as John makes it outside to check the mailbox, only to find that it's empty as he gets a call from his third friend Jade, who wants to know if he got her present yet. John sees the present locked in his dad's car so he can't get access to it, and begins to look through the windows of his home to see if his dad brought the beta inside, and sees it on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, John's call with Jade experiences interference, and when John inquires what happened, Jade doesn't know, but leaves to check out what happened. John then makes his way to the kitchen where he is spotted by his dad, and the two have an anime fight, resulting in John accidentally smoke bombing the house, causing the smoke alarms to go off, distracting his dad long enough for John to grab the beta and escape. Once John gets back to his room, he gets on a group call with his friends as he starts up the beta, and the pilot ends with the masked man switching to a different monitor, showcasing a montage of potential characters, locations, and adventures that will be introduced later in the series. The characters in this pilot aren't bad, but are by no means the selling point of the show. The main character John is nothing special, as he kinda just has a very basic protagonist personality. I know that may seem vague, but outside of his relationship with the supporting cast, there isn't really much about him that's notable, outside of his interests of being an aspiring magician, penchant for wearing disguises, and excessive habit of swearing seemingly every other sentence. It's not that I find John to be boring or unlikable or anything, but as far as main characters go, he is probably the most stereotypical protagonist I have seen in an indie animated project. He does, however, have really good chemistry with Dave. With Dave seemingly being an insensitive troll, one would think he would be a very unlikable character, and I could imagine that is the case for viewers who hate that kind of character, as he is purposefully obnoxious in a condescending bully sort of way, but the constant friendly yet mean-spirited bickering between John and Dave is probably one of the most believable and accurate portrayal of what a teenage boy friendship is like, and I found it refreshing as teenage male friendships, especially in animation, have always been represented either in a very Tumblr fashion or had a gimmicky caveat. So while Dave and John aren't especially interesting in themselves, I found their interactions with each other both entertaining and nostalgic, and contributed to making the pilot more enjoyable overall. In addition to Dave, we also have Rose, who by far is the most interesting character we know of yet. Rose, who may seem like an edgy goth character by her design, actually subverts viewer expectations as she acts very sophisticated with the way she speaks. You may come to the conclusion that she must be strict and serious given her design, but that couldn't be farther from the truth, as she is the most relaxed member of the cast, creating a unique contrast of a character who seemingly holds herself and others to a serious standard, but never forces that standard on others in a way that would come off as abrasive. Rose, in all design elements from her design and personality, is a walking juxtaposition who, just like Dave, has great chemistry and banter with John. Lastly, the odd girl out of the cast, we have Jade, who is the cheerful, energetic female archetype that is seemingly in every other animated show. In all fairness, she does seem a little more down-to-earth than her contemporaries, but still isn't anything I haven't seen before. That, along with the fact that she has the weakest interactions with John in comparison to Rose and Dave, makes her feel more disconnected from the rest of the cast and therefore the least interesting. Like I said, these 4 characters are by no means bad and are actually more believable than most indie animated shows' main casts, but I think this is why they come off as forgettable. Their personalities are ironically not animated enough for such a random indie animated show. Sure, their chemistry with each other is great and all, but the only character who is actually unique and interesting is Rose because of how incohesive her character is. Whereas the others are just archetypes that don't do anything new enough to make them stand out. The characters in Homestuck are mostly unremarkable, and that is a major issue for this indie pilot, as characters typically sell shows better than concepts, and the concepts of Homestuck are, a whole other issue. The purpose of a pilot is to present who the characters are and what the premise of the series is. And while I think that Homestuck succeeds at introducing the characters, despite having rewatched the pilot multiple times, I have absolutely no idea what this show is about. Homestuck doesn't even try to present a premise or a beginning of a plot. It just feels like a day in the life of a cast in a world where stuff kinda just happens without any explanation or follow-up. The closest we get to a plot thread in this pilot is a meteor shower that is occurring for all the characters, which is seemingly disrupting their method of communication, but that's it. There are plenty more things that happen in this pilot, but none of it is even remotely explained. The characters all seemingly live in a simulation and they are all well aware of this, but it's never explained why. John apparently doesn't like interacting with his dad, but we never learn why, and once they encounter each other, they fight for seemingly no reason. Jade bought John a present, but it's just forgotten, so we never learn what the present is, and a myriad of other seemingly random events and details that without context don't make any sense and come off as more confusing than captivating. And if Homestuck wasn't confusing enough due to its complete lack of direction alone, this pilot has a severe identity problem, especially when it comes to the humor. Homestuck just isn't that funny. So much so that a part of me wonders if this series is even intended to be comedic. There are moments throughout the pilot that are supposed to be ridiculous for the sake of comedy, but throughout the pilot it never feels like Homestuck is actually trying to make the viewer laugh, and instead just puts these random gags for no other reason than being intentionally random. If you asked me what genre Homestuck is trying to be, I genuinely wouldn't be able to tell you, because this pilot doesn't convey a narrative tone. And when you pair a lack of plot, premise, and narrative, it becomes next to impossible to describe what Homestuck is or what it's trying to be. There was a scrap of some identity with this pilot, with it taking place in the late 2000s, but even that was executed poorly. As far as issues with this pilot go, this isn't really a big deal, but it did noticeably bother me that Homestuck is supposed to take place in the late 2000s, and yet the characters use modern-day mid-2020s slang. With the late 2000s now being over a decade and a half years old, there was a fun opportunity for Homestuck to lean into the culture of that era in an over-exaggerated way, but instead the only thing that really embodies that time period in this pilot is a game review magazine and a physical PC disc beta for a game, which I'm pretty sure was more of an early 2000s thing rather than a late 2000s thing. Again, this is more of just a missed opportunity than an actual flaw that made the pilot worse, so I won't dwell on it for too long, but there is yet another issue that Homestuck has that may not be a big deal for some, but I wholeheartedly believe decreased the quality of this pilot. For anyone who has actually watched Vivziepop shows would know, The written by Vanitymoth meme is an over-exaggeration, but Homestuck, however, has so much swearing that it genuinely feels like the written by Vanitymoth meme. Whenever John and Dave interacted, it felt like no exaggeration to say that every other line of dialogue had one, if not multiple, swears in it, and it got old within the first 3 minutes of the pilot. I know ever since Vanitymoth became popular, there has been an ongoing criticism of animation with swearing in it, and me, being a fan of Panty and Stocking and South Park, have always had the stance that the swearing in Helluva Boss and Has-Been Hotel never actually degraded the quality of either of those shows, especially since they advertise themselves to adults. However, when it comes to Homestuck, outside of the swearing, there is nothing about this show that even comes close to adult. If you removed the swearing, this show wouldn't seem out of place on Disney Channel or Nickelodeon. And unlike the other Vanitymoth shows, the swearing is never used for comedic reasons, so that begs the question, what value does the swearing in Homestuck add? And for all I can tell, the answer is nothing. There isn't a single scene or line of dialogue that was augmented by the swearing in Homestuck. And I am 100% certain that of all the creative decisions that were made, the unnecessary swearing damaged this pilot more than any of them. Not only did it reduce the age demographic of potential viewers for no good reason, but even for people who enjoy swearing in media, the swearing doesn't benefit this pilot in any tangible way, resulting in a net negative addition to the pilot. If there is anything that Homestuck needs to change with this series, if it continues, is the swearing needs to be drastically reduced, if not removed altogether. And if it does so, I can guarantee the show will be better for it. So you may be wondering at this point what redeeming qualities this pilot even has, and what could have it possibly done for me to consider it to be my favorite indie animated pilot of 2025. Well, for starters, the pacing is actually impressively good for being 11 minutes long. There never felt like there was a moment that dragged on or felt paused as the pilot continued a steady momentum throughout, without it ever feeling rushed. There were enough environmental changes to always feel like the pilot was progressing, all the characters were introduced effectively within 2 or 3 lines of dialogue, and the exposition that was present felt necessary and presented in a quick enough manner that it felt natural and unobtrusive. It's one of those pilots that feels longer than it is, and in this case it's for the better, proving that the production team nailed the pacing, making it an easy and enjoyable rewatch. And when I say enjoyable to rewatch, I mean that quite literally, as the visuals of Homestuck are remarkably fun to perceive. I know that most would argue that more colorful animation is more stimulating to the eye, but there is something very visually satisfying about the monochromatic style with hints of color that Homestuck chose to go with. That, along with the fourth wall breaking visual interactions the characters have when they interact with the world, especially throughout the fight scene, makes Homestuck not only entertaining visually, but also one of the most visually creative and experimental indie projects I have seen. But above all, what impressed me more about this pilot than anything else is that despite it doing more things wrong than right, it made me interested. As I mentioned earlier, the job of a pilot is to introduce characters and a premise, and the reason for that is because traditionally, those are the aspects of a pilot that would encourage viewers to continue watching the show, and this pilot doesn't do that. But Homestuck compensates for this lack of a vital storytelling component with its sheer absurdity, unpredictability, and visual creativity. The world's vague world building, the characters' chemistry, the fun visuals, and the final scene of the pilot that teased a wide array of environments and antagonists that the cast will encounter all played a role in me actively wanting to see future episodes, which at the end of the day is what a pilot is supposed to do. Yes, Homestuck didn't follow the methods of what makes a good pilot, but it still served its purpose of creating interest in the series. And that's far more impressive than any other pilot that executes traditional pilot storytelling methods effectively. And this accomplishment is even more impressive and in a way relieving because Homestuck isn't the first indie pilot to try this, but it is the first to do it well. I criticized Lackadaisy and Ramshackle for these exact same issues, but what Homestuck did differently that actually made it work is that it left enough loose world-building threads that caused as much confusion as intrigue to make the viewer want to see future installments. It's very obvious that Homestuck knows what it wants to be, but it's actively presenting itself in a deliberately vague and confusing manner to build investment in its audience. And that is a risky gambit that obviously didn't pay off as well with the indie animation crowd as it did with me, but given all the legitimate issues Homestuck does have, that is understandable. Homestuck isn't a good series pilot. In fact, I would say it's a borderline disaster. The characters aren't interesting enough, there are no plot hooks, a premise isn't established, the humor doesn't work on any level, the show doesn't feel like it has an identity, the swearing is obnoxiously excessive, and it's so random and confusing that it's not easy to digest for anyone who isn't already a fan of the webcomic. The only overtly positive aspects about Homestuck are its creatively splendid animation direction, great pacing, and the above-average background music. It's undeniable that Homestuck didn't follow a single rule of how to make a good pilot. But if the very purpose of a pilot is to make the viewer want to watch more episodes, due to it purely being novel and interesting, it achieved that goal better than not only most indie animated pilots, but better than most animated pilots I have seen in my life, and made me more excited for this series' future than any indie animated project currently in development.